Walter had never been a man of many words. He preferred the quiet of his small, cozy house tucked away at the edge of a quiet town. His days were simple, filled with routine: early morning walks with Max, breakfast on the porch, and afternoons tending to his garden. But for all the simplicity of his life, it was rich with a deep, unspoken bond. A bond that had been forged over the years with Max, his loyal German shepherd. Max wasn't just a dog. He was Walter's best friend, his confidant, and his closest companion. They had been inseparable since the day Walter had adopted him from the local shelter, a scrawny puppy with big brown eyes and a wagging tail. Over time, Max had grown into a strong, protective dog, always by Walter's side, never straying far from the old man's reach. There was a rhythm to their days together. Every morning, as soon as the first rays of sunlight peeked through the windows, Max would nudge Walter awake with a gentle paw. Walter would stretch, rub his eyes, and smile as he met Max's eager, expectant gaze. Together, they'd take a walk down the quiet roads, the only sounds being Max's paws patting against the earth and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Walter wasn't one for crowds or busy places. He liked the solitude of his home, where he could focus on the little things that mattered most: the flowers in his garden, the books that filled his shelves, and the laughter of his grandchildren when they visited. But no one gave him as much comfort as Max did. The dog had a way of sensing when Walter was troubled. If the old man was feeling down or lonely, Max would sit by his feet, resting his head on his lap, offering silent comfort. There was never any need for words between them. Their connection was felt in every glance, every moment spent together. Max followed Walter through every room of the house, always present, always looking out for him. He slept by Walter's bed at night, the sound of his steady breathing a constant reassurance. In the mornings, Max would happily carry the newspaper to Walter, his tail wagging furiously, as though he knew it was just another small way to make the old man smile. Max wasn't just a dog. He was family. And for Walter, that was enough. In a world that often seemed overwhelming and full of change, Max was the one constant he could rely on. Their lives were simple, yet they shared a love that felt as deep and enduring as the roots of the old oak tree that stood in Walter's backyard. It was a warm, late spring afternoon when everything shifted for Walter and Max. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the small house and garden. Walter had been out tending to his beloved roses, bending over gently to inspect each flower as Max sat nearby, watching him with attentive eyes. It was a peaceful moment, the kind Walter had grown accustomed to over the years. But then, without warning, the calm was shattered. Walter suddenly staggered, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as his hand went to his chest. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the soft grass. Max immediately leaped to his feet, barking loudly, his voice filled with urgency and panic. He trotted in circles around Walter, licking his face, trying to rouse him. But Walter didn't respond. Max's instincts kicked in. He ran to the front door, pawing at it, his panic rising. He knew something was terribly wrong. When the neighbors heard the commotion, they rushed over, finding Max frantic and Walter motionless on the ground. The sight of the man they all knew and loved, lying there so still, sent a chill through their spines. They quickly called an ambulance, but Max wouldn't leave Walter's side. The paramedics arrived just as Max stood guard over his fallen companion. They gently placed Walter onto a stretcher, but Max was not ready to let him go. He growled low in his throat, his eyes locked onto Walter's face as the men began to load him into the ambulance. It was as though Max understood that this was no ordinary trip to the doctor. This was something different, something far more serious. Max tried to jump into the vehicle, his paws scrabbling against the ground in a desperate attempt to stay close to Walter. The paramedics tried to hold him back, speaking softly to the dog, but Max wouldn't listen. He whined, a sound filled with confusion and fear. The doors of the ambulance shut with a soft thud, and with one last look at Walter, Max stood motionless in the driveway, his tail drooping and ears low. As the ambulance drove away, Max stayed rooted in place, staring after it until it disappeared around the corner. The world felt different now. Quiet. Empty. Max knew deep down that things had changed in a way that could never be undone. He waited, though, as though hoping Walter would return to him any minute. But the minutes stretched into hours, and the sinking feeling in his chest grew stronger. The days that followed were filled with silence. Max could sense it. The house was quieter than usual, and the absence of Walter's steady presence weighed heavily in the air. It wasn't the absence of sounds, the ticking clock, the distant chirping of birds. It was the absence of the man who had always been there. Max had always known his place by Walter's side, and now everything felt disjointed and uncertain. At first, Max tried to continue his usual routine. He stood by the door in the morning, waiting for Walter to appear with his familiar smile and morning pat, but Walter never came. He waited at the foot of the stairs, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Walter would always descend. Nothing happened. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Neighbors came and went, checking on Max and offering comfort, but the old dog remained distant. He wasn't interested in the food they brought or the pats they gave him. Nothing could replace the person who meant everything to him. Max would give them a quick glance, but then he'd return to his post by the door, staring out the window, hoping, waiting. He wanted to believe that any moment Walter would walk through the door, his slow but steady footsteps tapping against the wooden floor. The neighbors tried to coax Max into the yard for a walk, hoping the fresh air would help calm him. But Max refused. He would stand by the door, his head tilted slightly, ears perked, listening for the familiar sound of Walter's voice. Every time a car passed, Max would jump up and run to the window, tail wagging in expectation. When the car stopped, and the person did not step out with Walter in tow, Max would slump back down, his body heavy with the weight of disappointment. The food in his bowl sat untouched, and the water grew still. Days stretched into nights, and Max's hope didn't fade. He simply refused to accept that Walter wouldn't be coming back. He would not leave his spot by the door, as if believing that his loyalty might bring Walter home. The house, once filled with the hum of their shared life, now felt empty and cold, a shell of what it had been. Max lay in the sunken chair by the front door, staring out, every so often giving a quiet, mournful whine, a sound that spoke volumes of his confusion, his yearning, and his unshakable belief that Walter would return. It was a heartache that only a dog, with his unwavering devotion, could understand. As the days turned into a week, the neighbors began to notice how Max seemed to grow more restless, more withdrawn. His once proud stance now sagged with sorrow, and his eyes, once so full of life and excitement, were dull and heavy with the weight of grief. Despite the warmth of the spring sun, Max refused to step out of the house, staying near the door as if he could will Walter to return. One afternoon, after receiving the difficult news that Walter's condition had taken a turn for the worse, the neighbors decided to take action. They could see how much Max had been affected by the silence, how his once vibrant energy had slowly drained away. They had an idea, one last chance for Max to see the man who had been everything to him. They called the hospital to make arrangements. The staff, understanding the bond between man and dog, agreed to let Max visit Walter in the hospital courtyard. The plan was simple. Max would get a brief moment to see his beloved Walter, even if they couldn't be together as they once had been. The neighbors gently attached Max's leash and led him out of the house, the dog's steps slow but steady as he trotted beside them. They didn't speak much. They knew Max's heart was heavy, and words seemed unnecessary. When they arrived at the hospital, Max's tail began to twitch with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The familiar smell of antiseptic and sterile floors filled the air, but it was the scent of Walter's cologne that lingered faintly, like a thread of hope. Max sniffed the ground eagerly, his nose leading him toward the hospital doors, as though he could already sense that Walter was close. The staff led them to a small courtyard where Walter was resting in a chair, his face pale, but his eyes still holding that same warmth Max had always known. It took a moment before Walter's eyes met Max's, and when they did, something shifted in the air. Max froze, his ears perked up as his tail began to wag slowly, unsure at first, but growing in speed as the recognition hit him. Walter's hand, frail and trembling, reached out toward the window. Max's eyes glistened as he walked forward, his body moving as if guided by a force greater than his own. When Max finally stood before the window, he pressed his nose gently against the glass, gazing at Walter with a silent intensity. Walter's lips curved into a weak but genuine smile, and though he could not speak, his eyes said everything. Max whimpered softly, as if to say, "I'm here. I haven't forgotten you." In the moments that followed, time seemed to slow. Max stood at the window, his body pressed against the cold glass, as though trying to reach Walter, to make contact one last time. His tail wagged slowly, a soft thump against the ground, his eyes never leaving the man who had been his whole world. Walter, weak and frail, smiled faintly as he gazed back at Max, his hand resting gently on the windowsill. For Max, it was as if the world outside had faded. The bustling sounds of the hospital, the people moving around, all melted away. All that mattered was Walter, standing there alive, even if only just. Max's heart ached, a deep, painful yearning that no words could capture. There was a silence between them, but it spoke volumes. Walter's eyes flickered with recognition, and though he couldn't speak, his gaze conveyed everything he needed to say. It was as if they were communicating through a shared understanding, a bond that could never be broken. The gentle smile on Walter's face grew weaker, but in it there was a sense of peace. He was telling Max, without words, that it was okay. That Max had been a good boy, a loyal friend, and now he could let go. Max let out a soft whine, pressing his nose harder against the glass, as if trying to comfort Walter one last time. His heart hurt as he realized that Walter's time on this earth was nearing its end. The strength that had once radiated from the man was now fading, leaving only the quiet rhythm of his breathing. Max could feel it in the stillness of the air, a stillness that spoke of an inevitable goodbye. The nurses, understanding the moment, quietly gave them the time they needed. Walter's hand trembled as he reached out, touching the glass where Max's nose had left an imprint. Max's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his body tense with emotion. He had always been the protector, always by Walter's side, but now it was Walter who was telling him it was time to say goodbye. The moment lingered, and for Max, it felt like an eternity. He knew deep down that Walter wasn't going to make it, but in that one precious moment, the two of them were connected by a love that would never fade, no matter the distance, no matter the time. Max pressed his face against the glass, taking in the warmth of Walter's gaze one last time. He vowed silently, with every fiber of his being, that he would never forget this man, the man who had given him everything. The days after Walter's passing were the hardest Max had ever known. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and footsteps, now felt eerily quiet. Max wandered from room to room, his paws echoing softly against the wooden floors, searching for the familiar presence of Walter. But Walter was gone, and the emptiness of the house seemed to mirror the emptiness in Max's heart. He still slept by Walter's side of the bed, curling up on the floor as though waiting for the man to return. Every night, as the moonlight filtered through the window, Max would stare at the door, his tail occasionally twitching in hope. But each time, he woke to find the same silence. No soft footsteps, no gentle pat on the head, just the hollow quiet of a house without its heartbeat. The neighbors tried to console him. They would come by every day, bringing him food and treats, but Max wouldn't eat. He wasn't interested in anything except waiting. They could see the loyalty in his eyes, the deep devotion he still held for Walter. They knew that, no matter what, Max wouldn't leave his post. He wouldn't give up on the man who had loved him for so many years. Despite his grief, Max's routine didn't change. He still stood by the door every morning, looking out over the quiet street as if expecting Walter to walk down the road, carrying his gardening tools or his coat. But Walter never came. It was as though the world outside had continued to move forward, but Max was stuck in time, waiting for a man who would never return. At times, Max would go to the garden, his nose brushing the petals of the flowers Walter had so lovingly tended. The smell of roses and lavender filled the air, but it was bittersweet. He could almost hear Walter's voice, soft and gentle, speaking to him as they had so many times before. But the garden was empty now. The flowers swayed in the breeze, but there was no one to admire them, no one to smile at the work they had done together. Max began to spend more time in the yard, lying near the fence where Walter had always stood to watch the world go by. His eyes would wander to the old oak tree, the one where Walter had carved their initials all those years ago. The memories, though painful, were all he had left. Max would stay there for hours, his body heavy with sadness, but his heart filled with a quiet resolve. Even without Walter's presence, Max remained steadfast. He was still guarding the house, still waiting. And though he couldn't understand why Walter had to leave, Max knew one thing for certain: he would never forget. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons began to change. The vibrant colors of summer faded into the cool tones of fall, and the house, once a lively home, now stood still. Max remained, a solitary figure at the window or lying in the yard, his eyes often fixed on the road where he had once waited for Walter's return. The world continued to turn, yet Max refused to move forward. His loyalty to Walter anchored him to the past, and he became a quiet sentinel in a home that had lost its heartbeat. Neighbors who had once admired the bond between Walter and Max now spoke of the old dog with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. They would often stop by, leaving food for Max, trying to coax him out of his melancholy, but the dog never responded with the enthusiasm he once had. He ate only when he was hungry, and even then, it seemed as though the act was mechanical, something he did because it was expected, not because he had any joy in it. In the evenings, when the sky turned a soft shade of lavender and the stars began to twinkle, Max would walk slowly around the yard. His steps were measured, deliberate, as though he was guarding the very memories of his life with Walter. He no longer chased after sticks or sniffed the flowers. Instead, he stood by the fence, his nose gently brushing against the wood as he watched the horizon. It was there, by the fence, where Walter had always stood, leaning on the same post, watching the world in silence. Max could almost feel the presence of his friend in the cool breeze, a faint echo of their shared moments. Max's world had shrunk to the house and the yard. He didn't interact with the other dogs in the neighborhood. He wasn't interested in playing or running. He was simply there, keeping watch, as if protecting the memories of a life that no longer existed. It was his way of honoring Walter, by guarding the place they had shared, by holding on to the pieces of a life that would never be again. On the days when the sun was especially bright, Max would walk to the garden, where Walter's favorite roses still bloomed. He would lie down among the flowers, resting his head on the ground as if trying to breathe in the last traces of Walter's presence. The scent of the roses, mingled with the earth, brought some comfort, but it also reminded him of how much he missed his owner. Max had become the guardian of their memories, the dog who refused to let go, even as time marched on. His eyes, though weary, still held the same quiet strength. He would never leave. Not now. Not ever. One evening, as winter approached, Max found himself once again standing near the fence. The air was crisp and the last of the golden leaves swirled gently in the wind. It had been a long time since Walter had passed, but there were days when it still felt like he could hear the old man's voice, or catch a glimpse of him moving around the house. But those moments were fleeting, like shadows at dusk, fading almost as soon as they arrived. Max's eyes, now clouded with age, scanned the horizon. He had grown thinner over the months, his once powerful frame now marked by the slowing of time. Yet there was a strength in his stance, a silent promise that he would never abandon his post. He had waited so long, and though his body had weakened, his spirit remained steadfast. That evening, as he stood by the fence, something unusual caught Max's attention. A soft breeze blew, and the faintest hint of Walter's scent lingered in the air. It was so subtle, so fleeting, that Max almost wondered if it had been his imagination. But he stood still, his body frozen, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as though savoring the last remnants of his companion's presence. Walter had always been there for him, through the hard times and the good. Max had given everything to protect him, to love him, and now, it was time for him to honor that bond one last time. The dog walked slowly toward the oak tree, the one where Walter had carved their initials years ago. He stopped at the base of the tree, laying down on the cool ground beneath it. His breathing slowed, and he closed his eyes once more. For a moment, Max could almost see Walter sitting beside him, resting his hand gently on the dog's back, just like he had done on so many evenings before. It was as though time had folded itself back, and in that brief moment, they were together again. Max let out a soft sigh, the kind of sigh that spoke of years of love and loyalty. He knew Walter was no longer here, but the bond they shared could never truly fade. With his heart full of gratitude, Max gave a final look to the house, the garden, and the oak tree. He had kept his promise. He had been Walter's protector, his companion, and now he would continue to be the guardian of their memories. Max, the loyal German shepherd, finally rested beneath the tree where his journey with Walter had begun. He had waited, as he always had, and now he could rest in peace, knowing that he had loved and been loved in return.